By the time Graham Wexler slid the settlement across the polished table in that Gold Coast office, he was already wearing the expression of a man who believed the room belonged to him. Stuart Bellamy read the terms in his dry, expensive cadence, while I sat in my beige coat and watched my life reduced to a used sedan. $28,000 in debt. And no support. Graham barely looked at me when he murmured, "Sign it, Mara. Don't turn this into theater." And the neat stack of pages between us told me he thought he had already won. I let my fingers rest on the paper, then lifted my eyes and asked the only question that mattered, whether he was absolutely certain he wanted the waiver on all present and future claims. Stuart gave me a thin smile, and Graham exhaled like I was wasting valuable air, then said, "Your future assets are a craft counter and a checking account. So, yes." I signed first, smooth and fast, then watched him carve his own name across the line with that smug flourish he always used when he thought money made him look intelligent. The notary stamped the final page. Stuart gathered the copies, and Graham reached for his phone, already halfway out of the marriage before the ink had settled. I took a makeup wipe from my pocket, stripped the false redness from under my eyes, pushed my hair back, and stood up straight just as the door opened behind him. Calvin Rourke stepped inside, looked directly at me, and said, "Ms. Halbrook, the transfer instructions are ready." And Graham turned so slowly I could see the color leave his face. For one clean second, he only stared. Like his mind had hit a wall, it could not charm, negotiate, or bully into moving. And that was the first honest thing I had seen on him. I held his gaze and told him my real name was Madeline Halbrook, that he had just waived every claim to my trusts, inheritance, and business interests, and that he had done it voluntarily. Then Calvin placed the folder beside my hand. Graham looked down at the Halbrook letterhead, and I watched him understand that he had not left me with nothing. He had cut himself off from everything. I met Graham while I was working under the name Mara Sutton in a paper boutique off Oak Street, where everything smelled like cotton stock, wax seals, and polished restraint. I wore flat shoes, soft cardigans, and the kind of face that made polished men assume I apologized before speaking, which Graham mistook for admiration almost immediately. He liked paying for coffee I could have bought myself, liked explaining taxes over dinner, and liked leaning back when I went quiet because my silence made him feel taller. I let him believe the store was my whole world, that my careful spending came from limitation instead of discipline, and that my discomfort around his clients came from insecurity instead of observation. At his office events, I ordered sparkling water, listened to men like Graham speak in confident half-truths, and watched who interrupted waiters, who lied casually, and who enjoyed an audience too much. Sabrina Doyle stood out early, not because she was subtle, but because every time Graham made a point, her mouth sharpened first and her laugh arrived half a beat too fast. What exposed them was never one dramatic mistake, only a trail of hard little things that did not belong together, beginning with a minibar charge in Milwaukee on a night Graham swore he was stranded with clients. Then came a boutique hotel receipt buried inside a reimbursement packet, followed by a deck Sabrina had accidentally forwarded to his personal inbox, still carrying tracked edits made after midnight from the same suite. When the balance alerts on the cards under my name started rising past groceries and household bills, I pulled my credit report, saw 2 accounts I had never opened, and stopped wondering whether I was being betrayed. From that point forward, I did not need intuition because I had numbers, timestamps, addresses, and a marriage full of people who thought a quiet woman would never know how to read them. I let Graham sigh over my supposed carelessness, let Sabrina look through me at dinners, and let both of them build a future on the assumption that I was too small to measure it. The fraud sat there in black and white on my report. The hotel charges kept posting under my name. And by the time I called Calvin Rourke, I was done needing belief before evidence. Once the credit report showed the 2 accounts I had never opened, Calvin stopped treating my marriage like a sad domestic collapse and started treating it like a file. I sent him the hotel folios, the reimbursement packet, the forwarded deck with Sabrina's midnight edits, and the balance alerts from the cards climbing under my name. By the end of that first week, humiliation had hardened into sequence, because every lie Graham told me now sat beside a document with a date, an address, and a timestamp. Calvin arranged the evidence in the order a judge would understand, and that order stripped the affair of glamour faster than anger ever could. The Milwaukee minibar charge matched the night Graham texted that he was trapped in strategy meetings. The boutique hotel invoice matched Sabrina's edits from the same property, and the balances rose with each trip. When Calvin looked up and murmured that they had built overlap, not accidents, he was staring at IP logs, signature samples, and expense timing that kept bending back toward Graham. The Wyoming LLC changed the scale of everything because hidden money made the affair look less like betrayal and more like an exit plan funded through my identity. Graham was moving bonuses and consulting fees into an entity tied to his mother's maiden name, while the fraudulent cards kept loading debt onto mine. Sabrina was not a side effect of his ambition after that, because the receipts, edits, and travel patterns showed she was standing inside the same structure, benefiting from every false step he pushed onto me. So I gave Graham what he trusted most, a version of me small enough to confirm every ugly theory he had built about my limitations. I let my voice go thin over dinner, let my shoulders fold when he complained about money, and let him hear me apologize for balances I already knew were fabricated. While he relaxed into that performance, Calvin drafted the waiver wide enough to cut off present and future claims to trusts, inheritances, and business interests, and all I had left was timing. The notary gathered the signed pages. Stuart Bellamy stacked his copies, and Graham reached for his phone with the lazy relief of a man already spending money he thought he had protected. For a second, Graham only stared. Then his face pulled into a thin laugh that landed nowhere, because the folder in Calvin's hand carried Halbrook intermodal letterhead in dark blue. Stuart rose halfway out of his chair, suddenly careful, and I felt the room change around the evidence already sitting in plain view. The signed waiver, the stamped seal, and the name on that folder. He looked at Stuart first, not me, because men like Graham never search for truth until another man fails to hand it back to them. Then greed hit before remorse ever could, and he stepped toward the table and pushed out. If this is some kind of stunt, marital assets are still marital assets. I slid my hand over the waiver he had signed minutes earlier and answered. You insisted on a clean break, Graham, and Clause 4 cuts you off from everything you suddenly wish you had read more slowly. That was when Calvin set the second file beside the first, and the whole fantasy Graham had built around control began collapsing under documents instead of emotion. Inside that packet are the fraudulent applications, the bank footage, the IP logs, and the reimbursement trail tied to the charges under my name, I said, watching the blood leave his face again. He tried my old name like a plea, but I picked up my coat, looked straight at him, and told him he had not lost me that day. He had lost the future he thought he was smart enough to trap. By the time my plane dropped into Dallas, the divorce papers were already filed. My grandfather was already gone, and Halbrook Intermodal was already full of people rehearsing a future without me. Calvin sat across from me with the estate packet open, but I barely looked down because the only document I needed was the one Graham had signed hours earlier. When the car turned into headquarters before sunrise, the glass facade reflected a company my family had built over 3 generations, and a boardroom upstairs that expected me to arrive unprepared. Preston Keating had called the emergency meeting before my wheels even touched Texas, which told me he had not been grieving. He had been counting. I walked in wearing the dark suit Calvin had packed for me, and Preston barely paused before saying the company needed experienced hands, stable optics, and immediate transitional control. The room stayed quiet after that, because everyone seated around the table understood exactly what he meant. And because nobody there mistook that sentence for concern, he started listing problems as if volume could pass for authority. Stalled lanes in Missouri. Temperature, compliance, pressure, fuel exposure, thinning margins, and nervous lenders waiting for weakness. I let him keep going until the screen behind him filled with the numbers he thought would corner me. Then I slid a second packet across the table and told him to use the real reports. Preston did not touch the folder immediately, which was the first honest reaction he had given me, because the cover sheet carried internal audit timestamps, root variance logs, and approval chains tied to his credentials. Once the board secretary opened it, the room stopped belonging to Preston, because every excuse he had just offered now sat beside a record showing who altered dispatch timing and who buried carrier violations. The fuel losses he blamed on market conditions matched emails steering business toward a subcontractor with weak refrigeration compliance, and the rate pressure matched back-channel notes with outside money circling for a discount entry. I did not raise my voice when I told him he was not protecting this company from instability. He was manufacturing it long enough to sell panic at a reduced price. Nobody defended him after that, because nobody could argue with the login trail, the redlined approvals, and the side correspondence already printed in front of them. Calvin stepped in only long enough to preserve records, suspend access, and state that outside counsel would coordinate with the proper authorities, while security waited beyond the door. Then I took my grandfather's chair, looked at the same people who had prepared to survive me, and told them there would be no interim ruler because I had not come to inherit a frightened company. I had come to keep it. Back in Chicago, Graham did what men like him always do when consequence finally reaches them. He started renaming his own appetite until it sounded principled enough to sell. The frozen accounts, the missing office keycard, and the silence from people who used to answer on the first ring did not make him ashamed. They made him inventive. By the time Sabrina cut contact and limited herself to whatever cooperation kept her from going down with him, Graham had already decided he was not greedy, only wronged. His new lawyer repackaged the same hunger in cleaner language, arguing that I had concealed material facts, distorted the foundation of the marriage, and deprived him of an informed financial choice. Graham leaned on that theory because it let him keep one hand on the fantasy that he was still a serious man with a serious claim, not a fraud defendant scrambling in borrowed time. The truth was already sitting in the file he wanted ignored. The hidden Wyoming LLC, the forged credit lines, the reimbursement trail, and the waiver he had read only when he believed I had nothing. That was not enough for him once the scale of Halbrook became real, because a man who realizes he walked himself away from a fortune does not settle for losing quietly. He went back toward the old apartment in Chicago, reached for the devices and notebooks he thought still held my habits, and started treating memory like inventory. When Halbrook security flagged the attempted access and Calvin's team preserved the building logs, the shape of Graham's next move became visible before he understood how exposed he already was. What followed was uglier than the marriage because it stripped away the last excuse of emotion and left only transaction. Using an anonymous channel tied to a prepaid device, Graham reached out to Preston Keating and offered private journals, old laptops, and what he called behavioral leverage in exchange for money and alignment. He was trying to sell an advantage built from years of watching me breathe. And the message stopped being a bluff the moment digital forensics tied the burner back to his location and preserved the exchange. When the hearing opened in Chicago, Graham came in wearing a darker suit, a practiced expression, and the kind of injured restraint men borrow when evidence has already stripped them of authority. His lawyer tried to frame the marriage as fraud by omission, insisting Graham had been denied an informed choice because I concealed the wealth, structure, and scale behind my real name. I sat beside Calvin and listened without moving, because the complaint only worked if the court forgot the waiver, the forged accounts, and the debt he had carefully loaded onto me first. The judge did not forget, and neither did the file. which was already thick with dates, signatures, access logs, hotel invoices, and the reimbursement trail Graham wanted treated as irrelevant private mess. When his lawyer pushed harder and called it equity, Calvin answered in the same calm register he used for estate transfers. Equity does not begin after a man learns he mispriced the woman he tried to ruin. Then he walked the court back through the signed waiver, the Wyoming LLC, the credit applications under my name, and the preserved access attempt at the old apartment. Graham made the mistake of looking wounded instead of careful, because wounded men invite sympathy, but a careless man invites sequence, and sequence was what buried him. Calvin introduced the burner channel, the building entry logs, the geolocation tie, and the message offering my private journals and devices to Preston for money and alignment. By the time the judge read the words behavioral leverage into the record, Graham's lawsuit stopped sounding like a husband asking for fairness and started sounding like a defendant trying to sell extortion as grievance. He stood-dried one last time, turning toward the bench and insisting he had been desperate, misled, and entitled to challenge a settlement signed under false assumptions. The judge cut straight through him with the same cold clarity the record had earned, saying, "Mr. Wexler, your problem is not that she deceived you. Your problem is that the documents remember what you did before you knew her value." After that, the motion collapsed exactly the way his image already had. Not with noise, but with the quiet finality of people in power deciding not to rescue him from his own paperwork. The social fallout moved faster than the legal one, because reputation people always understand danger before they understand shame. His profile disappeared from the firm website. Old clients stopped returning messages. Dinner invitations dried up. And the circles that once treated Graham like inevitable success began speaking about him in the past tense. Sabrina appeared only long enough to distance herself under oath. And by the time I walked out of that courthouse, Graham had finally learned the difference between losing me and being left alone with a record that refused to forget him. By the time the sentencing was over, I did not need the details repeated to feel what had closed, because the judgment, the restitution order, and the silence afterward were enough. Graham had years ahead of him under federal custody and supervision, and for the first time since our marriage, his future no longer had room to reach into mine. I used the exact $28,000 he once tried to bury me under to launch legal aid through the Halbrook Foundation, directing it toward spouses trapped inside financial abuse that never leaves bruises. I sold the apartment in Chicago where I had learned how small a woman can make herself before disappearing, and I never again practiced sounding grateful for neglect. In Dallas, I rebuilt the company without turning my pain into a slogan, closing the Southwest expansion, tightening compliance, and keeping my name where it belonged, on decisions instead of explanations. Healing arrived quieter than revenge. Inside ordinary things like sleeping through the night, hearing a locked door without flinching, and checking my accounts because I wanted clarity, not proof. What surprised me was not that Graham disappeared from rooms that once opened for him, but that I stopped needing updates to feel complete. I did not search his name, did not answer the few people who wanted my side packaged for gossip, and did not offer the world a graceful statement about survival. One evening in Texas, sitting across from a kind man who asked nothing from my story except honesty, I understood that peace was not forgetting him. It was no longer arranging my life against him. Thank you for staying with me through this story and for holding space for the quiet kind of strength that does not always look dramatic at first. If any part of this felt close to your own life, I hope you choose the version of love that does not ask you to shrink first. Leave your heart in the comments, and I hope the life waiting for you feels calm, clear, and fully yours.